The other day, I was driving my daughter Hazel, she's over here in the front pew. I was driving her and her teammates to a swim meet.
Yeah, she started the swim meet.
And they had started jokingly riffing on the idea of Jesus walking on water. One of them asked how Jesus could get baptized in the Jordan River if he walked on water. Wouldn't he have just floated on top of the water?
Is that what said was enough power?
What if he couldn't even take a bath? Because he would just float on the water in a bathtub. They were being so clever and funny as they were making these jokes, and they really knew their Bible stories. And what struck me was how funny they were being, and yet how respectful of their faith they were being as they were making these jokes. Easter is the most important day of the Christian year. But here at Holy Family, we like to keep things casual, even though we are very reverent. And I know there will be the sound of bells jingling all throughout this sermon, even though you will all try hard to hold them still. I learned this last year in my first Easter at Holy Family. Easter morning here is not only joyful, but it is a playful occasion. So this morning, I invite us to imagine these readings playfully, but with the utmost respect, just like those high schoolers in my car. Biblical scholars have often noted the comedy of these Easter New Testament readings. You can almost imagine a sketch comedy group reenacting this gospel story. Think Saturday Night Live, or maybe Monty Python. Mary gets to the empty tomb and the body is missing. Dramatic surprise! She runs back to tell everyone, and there's a slapstick race to see what's going on. And then the comedic irony of the mistaken identity when Mary thinks Jesus is the gardener. And then in our Acts story, which Alan read for us, when Peter is so passionately preaching about the miraculous life of Jesus, and it cuts off right before the very next line, which is, while Peter was still speaking, the Holy Spirit fell upon all who heard the words. The Holy Spirit completely interrupts his sermon, and all of a sudden everyone is having a mystical experience and no one is listening to him anymore. As a preacher, I can sympathize with that and see the comedy in it. So just take a moment to imagine your favorite sketch comedian. Maybe it's Tina Fey or Eric Idle or Will Ferrell is Jesus. Any of these stories could make a hilarious scene in a Mel Brooks movie. Why? Why this playfulness in these stories that are so foundational to Christian faith? It's because we need play. We need humor and lightness. Long ago, in a parenting class, my husband Colin and I learned that the best way to interrupt a tantrum or a meltdown is to tell a joke. There's some parents out here, so I'm very happy to impart this wisdom to you today. It really helped us. Humor signals to a panicked brain that fear is a false alarm. When we hear a joke, our brains perceive a tension or a threat in the setup of the joke. It triggers like a mini fight or flight response. And then the punchline of the joke reveals that the danger wasn't real. And then our body replaces those stress hormones like cortisol with a flood of dopamine and endorphins, and we laugh. That's how humor works. Humor also helps us shift out of the narrow tunnel vision of fear into a state of cognitive flexibility. If a person is experiencing a real fight or flight response, like a kid who's really angry, a joke can force a perspective shift because our brains cannot be in a state of high alert panic and appreciate a complex pun at the same time. This is probably the origin of dad jokes. By forcing our brain to engage higher level functions in the prefrontal cortex to get that joke, we pull power away from our primitive survival centers where we have that fight or flight spot, right? Our lizard brain. This is why gallows humor exists. People in stressful situations use humor to override the fatigue of a constant fight or flight state, to give their brain some relief from the constant stress that they feel. The comedic misunderstandings of our gospel stories show us that faith is not about having all the answers. The disciples stayed faithful even when they didn't understand. They didn't understand what Jesus said or what he did most of the time, but they stayed with him. Growing in our faith is a process of deepening our relationship with the holy, even during our very human times of doubt and fear and confusion. We all have doubts. When we wonder where God is as our heart breaks, and whether the things that frighten us most for ourselves and for the world will have the final word. And so, on Easter, the gospel writer is playful with us and gives us this silly moment when Mary Magdalene mistakes Jesus for a gardener, reminding us that our sadness and fear can prevent us from noticing God right in front of us. Just as a Shakespearean comedy ends with a marriage signaling a new beginning, the Easter story is the ultimate new beginning, purposefully launching the disciples into entirely new vocations and expanding their worldviews. And in Acts, we see Peter having this major perspective shift, realizing that no person is unclean. He's just had his whole brain opened up to the idea of expanding God's family beyond his own Jewish community. Just as we here strive to be a welcoming and inclusive church that reflects the diversity of God's holy family. After exploring all these facets of humor, something struck me about God's words to the prophet Jeremiah. The reading that Nina read for us so beautifully this morning. While the Israelites are deep in the despair of exile, that's when Jeremiah is writing, when he is a prophet. While they are deep in the despair of exile from their homeland, God promises them a return to Jerusalem, where they will take out their tambourines and dance in the ruins of their former home. This kind of absurd hope amidst total devastation probably sounded completely foolish to its original audience. And surprisingly, the hopeful declaration has the same anatomy as a joke. There is the very real threat of extinction in exile. And then, just as a punchline shatters the tension of a joke's setup, Jeremiah's prophecy shatters the finality of Israelites' destruction. The image of dancing in the ruins offers the ultimate release of tension, because the threat of exile and death has been subverted by God's grace. The humor of the New Testament stories brings us into playful perspective shifts that allow us to open our eyes and see God in front of us, and see the new things that God calls us to. And that is good. But hope is humor supercharged. If laughter tells us that some of our perceived threats aren't real, hope tells us that even the very real threats aren't final. Hope is the stubbornly faithful refusal to give in to fear, the willingness to believe in grace and find joy. To hope is to look at the brokenness of our world, the images of homes turned into ruins by war and violence, and by God's grace, to trust in the blueprint of restoration that God promises. May we be a people who use this gift not to look away from suffering, but to stand in the midst of it, uncrushed, unnarrowed, and stubbornly joyful, trusting that the one who rose on Easter morning is still at work in us and in the world, and that God's work will not be complete until every tear turns to laughter, and we dance with our tambourines in a world fully restored to God's new creation.